You hear stories about World War I and you picture trenches in France, mud, wire, gas. But 80 kilometers from the border of British East Africa, on the coast of what is now Tanzania, 8,000 troops walked into something else. November 1914, Tanga. A seaport town, terminus of the Usambra Railway, population maybe 5,000. The British Indian Expeditionary Force sailed from Bombay with one mission: bring all of German East Africa under British authority. Major General Arthur Edward Aitken commanded the force, 53 years old. Indian Army officer, confident from the start. He called it straightforward work. The only thing standing between him and conquest was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, and about 1,000 men, most of them African Askaris of the German Schutztruppe, 16 German officers. 55 Askaris killed before it ended, against 360 British dead, 8-1 odds. The Germans won. How? Before he leaves, he asks one question. Is the harbor mined? The Germans say yes, it is not mined, not one mine. But Caulfield believes them, spends the next day sweeping for mines that do not exist. 3 hours pass. The German flag still flies. Fox departs to bring in 14 troop transports carrying Force B. That delay changes everything. 200 miles inland at Moshi, von Lettow-Vorbeck hears the news. He boards the Usambara Railway with whatever troops he can gather. One company of Askaris already holds Tanga. By train from Neumoshe come reinforcements, the 7th and 8th Schützen Company and rifle companies of German settlers' sons. The 13th Askari Feld Company. The 4th arrives on November 4th. 6 companies total, around 1,000 men. His second in command is Captain Tom von Prince, born in Mauritius to a Scottish father and German mother, classmate of von Lettow-Vorbeck at Castle Military Academy, veteran of campaigns against the Hehe people, called Bwana Sakarani by his Askaris, the Wild One. On October 16th, 45 ships left Bombay. 14 were troop transports. Most soldiers got seasick within hours. One officer called the 2-week voyage a hell on crowded ships in tropical heat. The force included 1 regular British battalion, the 2nd Loyal North Lancashire Regiment. 3 Indian battalions, 4 more provided by an Indian prince, the Imperial Service Brigade, many poorly trained. Captain Richard Meinertzhagen served as Aitken's intelligence officer. He wrote in his diary that the senior officers were nearer to fossils than active, energetic leaders. He trembled to think what would happen if they met serious opposition. He pointed out the German Askaris were well trained and disciplined. Nobody listened. Aitken and Brigadier General Richard Wapshare clashed from the moment they left India. Meinertzhagen recorded it. Aitken was cold and rude to Wapshare, made no effort to conceal his lack of confidence. The command was fractured before a shot was fired. Aitken believed the harbor was mined, so he chose a beach to the east. By evening, most of Force B is ashore except the 27th Mountain Battery and the Faridkot Sappers. Noon, November 4th. Aitken orders the march on Tanga. No advance reconnaissance. Well-concealed defenders break up the advance immediately. The fighting turns to jungle skirmishing in coconut and palm oil plantations. Bitter street fighting near the harbor. The Kashmir Rifles and the 2nd Loyal North Lancashire Regiment make progress. They enter the town. Capture the customs house. Capture the Hotel Deutscher Kaiser. Run up the Union Jack. 1 Lancashire soldier goes into action with a pet green parrot on his shoulder. Then the advance stops. If you value documented military history and detailed research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the British Official History of the War, edited by Brigadier General Charles Hordern, and published in 1941, which called Tanga one of the most notable failures in British military history, and from Ross Anderson's detailed military analysis in the Battle of Tanga, published by Tempest in 2002, which examined original war diaries and dispatched documents from the Imperial War Museum archives. Now back to the information. Less well-trained Indian battalions run from the battle. Then it gets strange. Hanging from trees in the plantations are beehives. Local Africans make them from hollow logs. Rifle fire and machine gun fire shatter the hives. African honeybees swarm out. They attack both sides, no distinction. One signaller of the Royal Engineers tries to stay at his post, takes 300 stings on his head. Men are driven nearly insane. Some fall back just to escape the bees. The 98th Infantry breaks up under the swarm. British propaganda later claims the Germans planned it, rigged tripwires to agitate the hives. No evidence supports this. Even German machine guns went silent when the bees came. Von Lettow-Vorbeck himself wrote that at the decisive moment, all the machine guns of one of his companies were put out of action. Everyone ran. Their morale shatters after watching the 63rd Palamkata Light Infantry retreat. Late afternoon. Von Lettow-Vorbeck has 1 card left. He orders his last reserves forward. The 13th and 4th Askari Feldkompanion, the 4th just arrived by train minutes earlier. He orders bayonet attacks along the entire front, bugle calls, piercing tribal war cries. The attack envelops the British flank and rear. At least 3 battalions of the Imperial Service Brigade would have been wiped out to a man if they had not fled. All order vanishes. Force B's retirement degenerates into total rout, still outnumbered 8-1. Von Lettow-Vorbeck learns of this and countermands the move immediately, orders a redeployment. It takes until early morning to complete. For nearly the entire night before sunrise on November 5th, Tanga sits empty. Aitken could take it. His troops are disorganized, demoralized, and he does not know the town is undefended. The most stupendous irony of the battle. Troops abandon nearly all their equipment. Von Lettow-Vorbeck rearms 3 Askari companies with modern Lee-Enfield rifles, captures 600,000 rounds of ammunition, 16 machine guns, valuable field telephones, enough clothing to last the Schutztruppe for a year, hundreds of uniforms, medical supplies, tents, blankets, rations, several Maxim guns, enough rifles to replace 2/3 of his Askari's obsolete 1871 84 Mausers. The windfall allows his troops to resist the Allies for the rest of the war. Captain Richard Meinertzhagen enters Tanga under a white flag. He brings medical supplies, carries a letter from General Aitken apologizing for shelling the hospital. The streets are strewn with dead and wounded. German doctors and their African orderlies work tirelessly with what one witness called a fine disregard for their patients' uniforms. They treat British and German alike. Von Lettow-Vorbeck initially estimated 800 British dead. Later, he said he believed the number was more likely over 2,000. German and Askari losses: 16 Germans killed, 55 Askaris killed, 76 total wounded. Tom von Prince died on November 4th, fighting the 2nd Loyal North Lancashire Regiment. 9 German officers killed total. His funeral took place in Tanga with 12 other German officers. Von Lettow-Vorbeck called him splendid, a man he could not easily replace. The British released captured German officers after they gave their word not to fight again during the war. A gentleman's agreement in the opening months before the war became total. Aitken was recalled to London. Asked to explain how such a large force could have been defeated by just 1,000 German-led Askaris, he could not provide a suitable answer. Demoted to colonel in August 1915, subsequently retired. He wrote a 16-page account in 1915 from official and private documents trying to vindicate himself. Commented on ill-informed planning, lack of military intelligence data, poor quality and unpreparedness of his troops, complete demoralization of many Indian troops when met by defensive fire. The account sits in the Imperial War Museum. A vivid picture of ill-preparedness and confusion that pervaded the expedition. The defeat pointed to severe weaknesses in British planning and operations that would re-emerge at Gallipoli the following year. Almost all the Indian elements, except 2 Kashmiri battalions, were judged unreliable after the battle. Brigadier General Richard Wapshire replaced Aitken temporarily, but Meinertzhagen wrote, he was devoid of military knowledge and not in the same league as von Lettow-Vorbeck. He proved a positive danger because he was so indecisive and useless as a commander. His pleasant nature saved him from outright rejection, but he was quickly replaced by Brigadier General Michael Tighe. Remained undefeated by the time he surrendered on November 25, 1918, having belatedly heard of the armistice from a captured British prisoner. Returned to Germany a national hero, an East African Hindenburg. His Schutztruppe peaked at about 12,000 Askaris and 3,000 Europeans in the spring of 1916 after mobilizing settlers and receiving 2 blockade runners from Germany, supported by tens of thousands of Africans carrying supplies. When British, South African, Belgian, and Rhodesian forces began a combined offensive against the German colony in 1916, he initially fought entrenched battles in the north, eventually forced to retreat into the less accessible southeastern part of German East Africa. There, the lack of infrastructure, rainy season poor health, and supply problems protected his force from annihilation. 95 of von Lettow-Vorbeck's men were killed, but his army had been reduced to less than 1,000, so he withdrew. In December 1917, he launched a series of hard marches into Mozambique and routed Portuguese forces stationed there. His army lived off the land and requisitioned war supplies from ample Portuguese supply dumps. More than 300,000 Allied troops were deployed during the course of the war to defeat his force. He never suffered a single defeat. The Allies suffered 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 British and Indian dead in East Africa during the war. Famine killed thousands more. The weakened population became vulnerable to the Spanish influenza epidemic in 1919. Ludwig Deppe, a doctor of medicine who campaigned with von Lettow-Vorbeck and formerly headed the hospital at Tanga, wrote in 1919 that behind them they left destroyed fields, ransacked magazines, and starvation for the immediate future. They were no longer agents of culture. Their track was marked by death, plundered, and evacuated villages, just like the progress of armies in the 30 Years' War. Between Lakes Tanganyika and Nyasa in the Rwanda country, 20,000 natives died of starvation in 1 year alone, according to Belgian sources. Von Lettow-Vorbeck ended his campaign with 155 Europeans and more Askaris than he started with. He technically did not surrender, but merely disbanded his troops and put himself at the disposal of the British commander. He returned to Germany in 1919 and retired in 1920, entered politics, and served 10 years in the Reichstag, opposed the National Socialists. When the Nazis offered him an ambassadorial post, he refused. After German defeat and collapse in World War II, he lived in poverty. Jan Christian Smuts, the South African general who commanded Allied forces in East Africa and later became prime minister, had profound respect for him. Smuts arranged for von Lettow-Vorbeck to receive a pension from the victors. He continued to receive this pension until his death on March 9, 1964. 8,000 troops with modern equipment, artillery, naval support available but never called upon, facing 1,000 defenders. Poor intelligence, no reconnaissance, fractured command, poorly trained soldiers, overconfidence, a naval officer who told the enemy the attack was coming. A lie about mines that bought the defenders time. And on the other side, speed, audacity, interior lines, knowledge of terrain, well-trained Askaris who held their ground, and a commander who understood the principle of economy of force. Von Lettow-Vorbeck did not need to defeat the British decisively. He just needed to make them believe they were defeated. The customs house the Lancashire Regiment captured still stands, though it has been rebuilt. The Hotel Deutscher Kaiser is long gone. The Usambara Railway that brought the Askaris to battle still runs, though in disrepair. What remains is the record. The British official history called it one of the most notable failures. Meinertzhagen called it the most disgraceful defeat. But for von Lettow-Vorbeck and his Askaris, it was the beginning of a 4-year campaign that tied up hundreds of thousands of Allied troops who might have been used elsewhere. A strategic victory born from a tactical one. When Force B evacuated on November 5th and 6th, they left behind more than equipment. They left behind credibility. The myth of European military superiority took a blow on that beach. African Askaris fighting under German officers proved they could defeat a modern expeditionary force 8 times their size. The lessons were there. Speed matters. Knowledge of terrain matters. Morale matters. Unit cohesion matters. Leadership matters. But empires are slow learners. The same mistakes would be repeated at Gallipoli 6 months later. Different beach, different soldiers, same overconfidence, same lack of proper planning, same catastrophic result. In the chaos of November 4th, when bees swarmed and soldiers ran and bugles sounded and the Union Jack briefly flew over the Hotel Deutscher Kaiser, there was a moment when the battle could have gone either way. The Askaris withdrew. Tanga sat empty, but Aitken did not know, could not exploit it. By the time dawn broke on November 5th, the chance was gone. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's men were back in position. The British were loading their boats. The wounded were being carried back through surf. Equipment was being abandoned on the beach. And in the coconut plantations, the bees had returned to their shattered hives. Fight dozens of engagements, lose men to disease, starvation, combat, but he would never lose a battle. Tanga set the pattern. Use mobility, strike fast, withdraw before the enemy can concentrate force, live off captured supplies, keep the enemy off balance. It worked until the armistice. There's a photograph taken after the battle. Bodies of British Indian Expeditionary Force soldiers lying in the street. The image is in the German Federal Archives, Bundesarchiv, Bild 146-1971-057-05. The caption reads, Tanga, Englische Landung, gefallene Inder, English landing, fallen Indians. The photograph shows what the official reports tried to obscure. This was not a close battle. This was a rout. Men who never had a chance because their commanders failed them before the first shot. One detail haunts the record. When Meinertzhagen went ashore under the white flag on November 5th, he saw streets strewn with dead and wounded. German doctors worked with African orderlies, treating everyone regardless of uniform. That image, exhausted medical personnel moving from body to body in a town that smelled of death and cordite in the sea, that is what Tanga left behind. Not glory, not heroism, just the grinding machinery of colonial war consuming lives for a port town most of the world had never heard of. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's African Askaris went into Tanga with obsolete rifles. They came out armed with the best British weapons. They went in outnumbered 8-1. They came out victorious. The British went in expecting an easy victory. They came out shattered. And somewhere in those coconut groves, in the space between the Union Jack being raised and then torn down, between the bugle calls and the tribal war cries, between the machine gun fire and the swarms of bees, the nature of the East African campaign was decided. It would not be quick. It would not be easy, and it would cost more than anyone imagined. 48 brave Askaris and company carriers followed their German leaders into death in loyal fulfillment of their duty as soldiers. They too died for Emperor and Reich. The German heroes are mentioned by name and listed first in larger text. Only 1/3 of the sign is dedicated to the African victims, some of whom remain unnamed despite them making up the majority of casualties. That plaque tells you everything about how colonial powers saw their African soldiers. Brave, loyal, dutiful, but unnamed. 360 British killed by official count. Possibly 2,000 by von Lettow-Vorbeck's battlefield estimate. 16 Germans killed, 55 Askaris killed, 600,000 rounds of ammunition captured, 16 machine guns, enough rifles for 2/3 of a force. But numbers do not explain how it happened. How 8,000 became fewer than 1,000 in terms of effective combat power. How confidence became panic. How an amphibious assault with naval support and artillery available turned into soldiers running for boats while abandoning their equipment. The answer sits in those officer diaries and official reports. Aitken underestimated his enemy, ignored intelligence, failed to perform reconnaissance, fractured his command through personality conflicts. Caulfield gave away the element of surprise and wasted a day sweeping for non-existent mines. The Indian troops were poorly trained, many seeing their new rifles for the first time on the voyage. When the fighting started, and the attack stalled, and the bees came and officers fell, and the Askaris counterattacked with bayonets and war cries, the fragile cohesion shattered. What followed was not retreat, but rout. And once a rout begins, it feeds on itself. Panic spreads faster than any order can restore control. The bugle calls and war cries amplified it. The unexpected ferocity of men who were supposed to be easy to defeat completed it. By nightfall, November 4th, Force B was finished as an offensive instrument even though most of its soldiers were still alive, and its ships were still offshore, and its artillery had never fired a shot in support. They are won by speed, surprise, violence of action, and the moral component. Von Lettow-Vorbeck had all four. Aitken had none. The result was inevitable once the first shots were fired. Everything after was just the physical manifestation of moral collapse. In the coconut plantation on November 4th, 1914, when the bees descended and soldiers from Baluchistan and Punjab and Kashmir and Lancashire scattered in confusion, when Askaris fired from concealment and German officers shouted orders, and the tropical sun beat down and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of crushed vegetation and blood, there was a moment when someone realized this was not going according to plan. Maybe it was Aitken, maybe Wapshare, maybe one of the junior officers watching his men break and run. That moment of realization, that sudden understanding that everything was wrong, that the enemy was not weak and scattered, but concentrated and aggressive, that moment repeated itself at every level of command until the entire force shared the same terrible knowledge. We are going to lose. And they did lose. Spectacularly, comprehensively, in a way that made headlines and ended careers and changed the course of the East African campaign. All because Captain Caulfield asked about mines and believed a lie. All because 8,000 soldiers landed without reconnaissance against 1,000 defenders who knew the ground and had the will to fight. All because the bees were there in the trees and the bullets shattered the hives and nature itself seemed to take sides. There is a last detail from the archives. When Force B finally evacuated on November 6th, some soldiers had been ashore for 3 days without proper rest or food. They were exhausted, demoralized, stung by bees, defeated by an enemy they never understood. As the boats pulled away from shore and headed back to the transports, they could see Tanga behind them, the town they were supposed to capture on November 3rd, the town they briefly held on November 4th, the town they abandoned on November 5th, still flying the German flag. Still defended by Askaris, who had just won the first major battle of the East African campaign. And von Lettow-Vorbeck remembered it decades later when he visited Dar es Salaam in 1953, and surviving Askaris greeted him with their old marching song, Haya Safari. The bond forged at Tanga between German officers and African soldiers lasted a lifetime. Built on mutual respect, earned in combat, while the British bond with their Indian troops fractured on that same beach and had to be rebuilt slowly over the following years. It set the pattern for everything that followed. It gave von Lettow-Vorbeck the supplies and moral authority to wage his 4-year campaign. It cost the British dearly in prestige and blood. And it proved that, in the hands of a capable commander with well-trained troops who believed in their cause, terrain and surprise and speed could overcome enormous numerical disadvantages. That lesson echoed through the 20th century in countless colonial and guerrilla conflicts. The ghost of Tanga walks through them all. The implications were catastrophic for the Allies and transformative for the defenders. The battle, won by 1,000 men against 8,000, was not just a battle. It was a beginning It was the moment Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck's war truly began. He had secured his entire campaign. They had captured 16 modern machine guns. They had 600,000 rounds of ammunition. They had field telephones, medical supplies, rations, and enough khaki uniforms to outfit the Schutztruppe for a year. The Askaris, delighted, put on the British uniforms. For the rest of the war, von Lettow-Vorbeck's men would often be indistinguishable from the men hunting them. He had proven to his Askaris that the British were not invincible. He had proven that their training, their discipline, and their knowledge of the terrain, the Heimatkunde, was superior. The bond between the German officers and their African soldiers, sealed in the chaos of the bee swarm and the final bayonet charge, was now unbreakable. The fossils Meinertzhagen had warned about were swept aside, but the British response was slow, confused. The main effort was on the Western Front. Gallipoli was already being planned. East Africa was a sideshow, an embarrassment. This neglect was the second pillar of von Lettow-Vorbeck's strategy. He knew the Allies had more men, more guns, more ships, but he also knew their attention was divided. His primary goal was not to win German East Africa. His goal was to tie down as many Allied troops and as much Allied shipping as possible, pulling them away from Europe. Tanga proved this was possible. They fortified the border of British East Africa. They were terrified of another Tanga. He was no longer just a colonial garrison. He was an army, and he used that army with audacious speed. He launched raids into British territory, attacking the vital Uganda Railway. He blew up bridges, ambushed patrols, and vanished back into the bush. He was applying the lessons of the Boer War, a war he had studied intensely, against the very empire that had fought it. They had 2 armed steamers, the Hedwig von Wissmann and the Kingani. The British had nothing. This small flotilla allowed German troops to raid British and Belgian territory in the Congo and northern Rhodesia at will. The British Admiralty, in one of the strangest episodes of the war, devised a plan. They would send 2 motorboats, 45 feet long, from England to Lake Tanganyika. The boats were named Mimi and Tutu. Their journey was absurd. They were shipped to Cape Town, put on a train to Elizabethville in the Congo, dragged by teams of oxen and steam tractors through the jungle, and finally lowered into the lake. The entire expedition was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Spicer Simpson, a man who had been court-martialed for wrecking a destroyer and was known for his elaborate tattoos of snakes and butterflies. The German steamer, armed with a single small cannon, was no match for Mimi and Tutu, which carried 3-pounder guns and machine guns. The Kingani was captured after a short, sharp fight. 2 months later, in February 1916, they found and sank the Hedwig von Wissmann. German naval power on the lake was broken. Spicer Simpson became a hero to the local tribes, who revered him as Bwana Chifunga Tumbo, the lord who wears a skirt, a reference to his habit of wearing a khaki kilt. The German light cruiser SMS Königsberg had been terrorizing British shipping in the Indian Ocean. Trapped by a superior British blockade, she fled up the Rufiji River Delta, a dense, malarial maze of mangrove swamps. For months, she hid there, invisible to the blockading cruisers. The British, desperate to destroy her, sent shallow draft monitors, river gunboats, and eventually 2 seaplanes to spot her position. It was a clear British victory. These were the most powerful cannons in East Africa. They mounted them on improvised carriages, dragged them hundreds of miles inland, and formed them into his artillery. For the rest of the war, these naval guns, salvaged from a sunken cruiser in a swamp, would be the backbone of the German defense, surprising Allied columns with their range and power. The embarrassment of Tanga, the continued raids on the Uganda Railway, and the stalemate on the border were intolerable. They needed a commander who could finish the job. They found him in South Africa, General John Christian Smuts. A brilliant lawyer and philosopher, he had been one of the Boer's most effective guerrilla commanders against the British 2 decades earlier. Now, he was a general in the British Empire he had once fought. He assembled a massive army, 130,000 troops. South Africans, Rhodesians, Indians, British regulars, and the King's African Rifles. He had artillery, armored cars, and aircraft. Against him, von Lettow-Vorbeck had perhaps 15,000 men. He would invade German East Africa from the north, east, and west simultaneously, catching von Lettow-Vorbeck in a giant pincer movement. He would crush him with overwhelming numbers. But he immediately ran into trouble. At Salaita Hill, a South African brigade, confident of easy victory, attacked a fortified German position. They were met by withering, accurate machine gun fire and devastating artillery shelling from the salvaged Königsberg guns. The Askari defenders then counterattacked, just as they had at Tanga. The South Africans broke and ran, suffering over 130 casualties. When the British examined the battlefield, they made a bitter discovery. The Askaris had been firing captured British rifles. The machine guns were the same ones abandoned on the beach at Tanga. He fought short, sharp, delaying actions, inflicted casualties, and then retreated, luring Smuts deeper and deeper into the colony. The rainy season turned the unpaved roads into impassable rivers of mud. The tsetse fly killed thousands of draft animals, oxen, mules, and horses, by the score. Armored cars and supply trucks sank to their axles. The burden of logistics fell, as it always did in Africa, on human porters. The British employed over 1 million African carriers during the campaign. The Germans used hundreds of thousands as well. This was a war of legs and stomachs, and the carriers were the legs. Men, conscripted from their villages, carried 60-pound loads on their heads, marching 20 or 30 miles a day through jungle, swamp, and over mountains. They had little food, poor medical care, and brutal discipline. The official British history admits to over 50,000 carrier deaths in their own ranks, but modern estimates put the combined total for both sides at over 100,000 men. They died of malaria, dysentery, pneumonia, and sheer exhaustion. They were eaten by lions. They drowned in flooded rivers. They were the true, unmourned casualties of the campaign. For every soldier killed in combat, at least a dozen carriers and camp followers died of disease or starvation. Men came down with malaria by the thousand. At one point, Smuts reported that his frontline strength was reduced from 12,000 to less than 2,000 men by fever alone. The South Africans, raised on the high, dry veld, were particularly vulnerable. Von Lettow-Vorbeck, who dosed his men, German and Askari alike, with quinine as a matter of iron discipline, fared better, but his forces also dwindled. He took the capital, Dar es Salaam. On paper, he was winning. He declared the campaign all but over in late 1916 and left for London to join the Imperial War Cabinet. The German commander was now in the south of the colony. His force was reduced to just a few thousand. He was low on ammunition. He was surrounded. The British, now under General Jacob van Deventer, and the Belgians, advancing from the Congo, closed in for the kill in October 1917. At a place called Mahiwa, von Lettow-Vorbeck turned to fight. For 3 days, in a brutal close-quarters battle, his outnumbered Askaris fought a large British and Nigerian force to a standstill. The British suffered over 2,700 casualties, 50% of their force. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire African War. Von Lettow-Vorbeck lost 500 men, a crippling blow for his small army. But he had, once again, savaged his pursuers. He had inflicted another Tanga. His ammunition was almost gone. His men were starving. The colony was lost. Any other commander would have surrendered. In November 1917, with a column of just 300 remaining Germans, 1,700 Askaris, and several thousand carriers, he crossed the Rovuma River and invaded Portuguese Mozambique. The Portuguese, who had joined the Allies in 1916, were completely unprepared. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's column, now a true guerrilla force, marched through Mozambique for almost a year. They lived entirely off the land. They attacked Portuguese garrisons, who often fled, leaving behind vast stores of food, ammunition, and crucially, rifles. Just as he had at Tanga, von Lettow-Vorbeck rearmed and resupplied his entire army from his enemy. His Askaris traded their old Mausers for new Portuguese rifles and machine guns. His column swelled with new African recruits who joined him, drawn by his legend. The British, scrambling to react, sent forces into Mozambique to chase him, but they were hampered by the same problems: disease, terrain, and a complete lack of supplies. Von Lettow-Vorbeck, living off captured Portuguese food, was always one step ahead. In August 1918, he turned around. He reinvaded German East Africa, marched right through the British lines, and continued west. His goal was northern Rhodesia. He was being chased by the entire Allied war machine in Africa, but no one could catch him. He was marching his men 30 miles a day. On the morning of November 13, 1918, von Lettow-Vorbeck's column was approaching the Chambeshi River. They captured a British motorcyclist, a dispatch rider. The rider was carrying a message. It contained unbelievable news. An armistice had been signed in Europe. The war was over. It had ended 2 days earlier. On November 25, 1918, 14 days after the armistice in France, Paul-Emile von Lettow-Vorbeck formally surrendered his army. 1,168 Askaris, all in good health, all with rifles. They had ammunition, they had porters. They were an undefeated, effective fighting force. Von Lettow-Vorbeck, the last German general to surrender in World War I, had not lost a single battle. The cost of his 4-year campaign was beyond measure. 60,000 Allied soldiers killed or dead from disease, over 100,000 African carriers, perhaps 300,000 African civilians dead from the famines and plagues that followed the armies. He had, as he intended, tied up over 300,000 Allied troops who could have fought in France. He had cost the British Empire £200 million. The Askaris who had fought with him were eventually given pensions by the German government, which they collected well into the 1960s, identifying themselves to German embassy officials by presenting their old military paybooks, or in one case by stripping to the waist to show his combat scars. When von Lettow-Vorbeck salvaged the guns from the Königsberg and captured the rifles at Tanga, he was lauded for his genius. When he invaded Mozambique and fed his army from Portuguese stores, he was praised for his audacity. But this genius came at a price. As the Dr. Ludwig Deppe wrote, their path was marked by death and plundered villages. They were no longer agents of culture, they were agents of chaos. They learned that numbers meant nothing against a determined, well-led enemy who knew the terrain. They learned that logistics, not battles, win wars in Africa. And they learned that colonial superiority was a myth that could be shattered by machine gun fire, bayonet charges, and, as they first discovered in those chaotic coconut groves, the unexpected fury of swarming bees.